Hello and welcome back, everyone.
For our next session, we will have three very interesting speakers and interesting topics. First, we'll have Lois Evelet from Salve Regina University speaking on Pantheism. That'll be followed by Sebastian Mahfoud speaking on mosquito mating habits and the new atheism, which may or may not lead into the final paper by Robert Delfino of St. John's University, namely the failure of the new atheism morality. In the interest of time, we'll defer questions to the end of the reading of the or presentation of the three papers, and look forward to start hearing Lois's paper right now.
I think there's two interesting dates. 1975, the Universal Pantheist Society was established. And in 1999, a breakaway group, proudly calling itself the World Pantheist Movement, formed itself and went online. And since then, they've acquired a kind of a status because of the social media and the internet and so on. So now, pantheism has had a second life, a revival. And I think the internet is part of the story now. They can communicate. I'm using the word they, obviously, because I'm not a pantheist. They've had an ability now to communicate with one another, to share ideas, to even proselytize, to draw the like-minded into their fold. So the question is, as I pose on the handout, which you probably have by now, is why would anyone want to be a pantheist? This seems so strange, especially to a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim whose faith requires that we think of God and do want to think of God as being transcendent of His creation. So there are, though, admittedly Christian beliefs that might tend to suggest pantheism, that God is present in His creation by His almighty power, that God is present in the Spirit, is present in the soul of the baptized, and so on. And then, of course, there's an intriguing, I think, text in St. Paul, that is said by St. Paul, recorded in the Acts of the Apostles. I'm wondering if I can test your memory. And I happen to remember Acts of the Apostles, chapter 17, verse 28. Robert.
In God we live and move and have our being.
We live and move and have our being. And of course, I had to look up the Perseus project text, the Latin Greek for that. So I thought that was good. So if you have a Latinist or a Greek, then we can look up the words there as well. In Him we live and move and have our being. So that would suggest a kind of a pantheist suggestion. Of course, as you know, in the context of that phrase, Paul is addressing the Athenians, and he says, well, this is as certain as the poets have said. And so he's kind of distancing himself from it as well. So the question, though, God is nature and nature is God, the question of identity comes up, and the notion of transcendence, of course, is important. And of course, if God is infinite, how can we say that an apple tree is God, or a cockroach is God, or that I am God? And it just flies in the face of what we want a better term, common sense. Those three questions then govern my considerations here. Now, admittedly, I'm not going to read the whole paper. The paper is too long. But what I propose then instead is to give you 4 word pictures of each of these on those 3 points. And then at the end, by way of summary, to reflect on the notion of God specifically as it appears in each of those. So let's begin with our friend Giordano Bruno of Unhappy Memory. He is or was a combative, flamboyant, arrogant man, not a nice guy, apparently, from all accounts, and he was eventually a mistake. Now, if you happen to have seen the Cosmos presentation last year, which was really famous they made Giordano into a modern for science, and that, of course, flies in the face of history. That would be their research it, he was burned at the stake because he said Christ is not God, Christ is a magician. He denied the virgin transubstantiation. He said that Hermetism or Hermeticism is the one true religion. More on that. That has to do with magic. They're done in magic. He wrote a great deal about magic. And that's the Hermeticism, named after the god Hermes. And he was also clever with mnemonic devices. He wrote a great deal on memory training and ways and devices of remembering things that ought to be remembered. So where does he stand? Bruno begins with a view of human nature, a very positive, very one, that man is drawn inexorably and consistently to knowledge and to good, and that this is the dynamic of human life. And no matter how much knowledge or understanding or how much goodness he achieves or is or sees, he is nonetheless always good to achieve more and more. So you get in this, the Neoplatonic sense, you get the sense of Plato's cave, about the journey of man climbing upward, of Dante's Divine Comedy. All these notions of the human quest is inexorable and ongoing. And so he says, man seeks for the infinite. That's how he sums it up. Well, what does infinite mean? Well, the universe is infinite. That's true. And in fact, our world is one part of the universe. There's no guest who's not a scientist, but who's a good guesser. That the universe is vast, and there are other worlds within the universe, and there are other suns with other planets revolving around them, and there could be other people on those planets. He was a man, he was a great dreamer and a great, as they say, good guesser. The universe itself is infinite. Our world is a part of it. He uses the word substance for this, that everything is substance. The universe, he uses the word. And there are several words that use that you might want to refer to the reverse side of the handout, because I listed the main words that he uses throughout his writings to refer to what is real, what exists. And he says substance, cause, infinity, one, God. He uses those, I believe it's safe to say, as synonyms. So now the question is, how does the universe become associated with God? What I have here, the path that is a lineup of the path of reasoning that Bruno follows, so that if the same man who seeks after the infinite, that he can then say that the universe or the infinite is also God. There are 12 steps. If man seeks an infinite, then an infinite must exist. Why does he say this? How can he get away with it? Is it plausible? Yes, it's plausible, because he says that if there is not an infinite, man's quest for it is absurd. So he has those two choices, stark choices. Either life is absurd or it's not absurd. And he simply rejects the option of absurdity. This is not going to be his choice. So life is not absurd. That means there probably is in some way infinite. And certainly there is evidence in his mind that the universe is infinite. And so if an infinite exists, it must be knowable to some extent, because after all, that describes human nature. Therefore, we can conclude that man seeks an infinite, that infinite must be knowable to some extent. All right, now we have a disjunctive argument. Either God is knowable, or the universe, which is God's creation, is knowable. God is not knowable. Okay, God is not knowable. Therefore, the universe, the methodology, there's nothing like God's creation. If the universe is knowable, then the universe is infinite, sought by man. And now we fill in number 6. You know what number 6 was? The universe is knowable. Therefore, conclude the universe is infinite, sought by man. Okay? Plausible, possible, fairly reasonable. But God is infinite. This is your life. But God is infinite, and there can be only one infinite. So what can we conclude? Therefore, God is the universe, and the universe is infinite. Now, how do we explain finite particularity of things? Becomes the next question for all the pantheists. How do we explain the fact that we don't perceive, we don't apprehend what is infinite? reality and physical things which are finite. Well, now Bruno offers them two distinctions, and they are, of course, pulled out of a hat, pretty much the way a magician would pull a rabbit out of a hat. And he is a true magician, because now he says, we have to make a distinction. All right, there's an intensive infinity and there's an extensive infinity. Intensive infinity refers to God's. All God's attributes, everything about God is infinite. All right. Now, what does infinite mean? With regards to the universe, that's extensive. That means we can see extensive infinity. That's the we find that the universe has finite parts to it, and those we can apprehend. So now notice he's made a distinction between infinity, extensive infinity, and intensive infinity. And we ask why, what's the justification of the authority for that? Well, I don't think there is any, but it is his effort to salvage what he wants to say, that the universe and God are the same, and particular items are just those things or finite within the universe that we see. Then we could ask, well, infinite applied to God means something different than infinite applied to the universe. And he's also saying that the finite parts that make up the universe in some way all add up to infinite. So here we have two meanings. He's equivocating the notion of infinite. Infinite for the universe means we can't recognize the boundaries. We don't know what they are, whether space or time boundaries. Infinite applies to God. Well, he's all perfect and knowing the usual list that the theologians have talked about. All right, that's one distinction. The second distinction to try to explain particular finite items is that there's a distinction between God as principle and God as cause. God as principle means that he is immanent within his creation. And he creates and invigorates it from within. So he is coterminous with the universe. And yet, he is also cause. Cause means that God is remote or outside or transcendent. So when you think of cause, the word God as cause, you're not saying that God is transcendent. By saying God is principle, he's saying that God is immanent. Now, the justification, what is the justification for that distinction? Principle versus cause. It is the existence between finite and infinite itself. So the conclusion is being used to make the distinction in the first place, which of course represents certain reason. So what's the upshot of all of this? The universe is God, and yet God in some way transcends the universe because he is principle as well as cause of the universe. So it hinges, the success of what you're saying, or the integrity or credibility of it hinges on whether or not we accept those two distinctions that he's making. Now, I want to come back to that Bruno close again because this connection with magic has to be noticed. We fast forward now. Richard. Oh, that goes. All right, that goes very fast. Okay. Spinoza is found sophisticated. Spinoza is the pantheist. His purpose on ethics establishes on physics, which begins with the notion of necessary cause. Do we begin with something that's finite, caused by something else, or do we begin with something that's self-caused? That's where he chooses to begin. These are his conceptual tools. So the definitions are his, taken right out of the very beginning of the ethics, which he presents his pantheism. And so self-cause, the essence involves existence. That is nature conceived only as existing. And he calls it substance. Right? And substance then is the only thing that can exist. There are no finite substances. But we do experience finite things, and so he uses the word, conceives of the word modes. Everything that we experience is a mode within God. With more time, if you wish, we could go through attribute inspections and so on, because that's how he explains the coterminous, the fact that God and the universe are coterminous, but we are part of God. And so I can't spend more time on that. I think it's probably too long anyway. John Tolman, why did I put him in? He's the first one who used the word pantheist in English, so he gets a kind of a credibility here. At least he was thinking along those lines. He founded and established a group of freethinkers and mavericks in England, called Socratic Levy, Socratic Reality, and their purpose was to upset the apple cart and share. This was included on the social reform kind of purpose. And the group deliberately chose the word pantheist to describe what they were doing. They were rejecting the organized church, all kinds of ecclesiastical authorities, rejecting the student monarchy, hoping to reform, hoping to change the sovereignty, being the monarchy, being parliament, and so on. And so for Tolan, his version of the universe is pretty much that of Lucretius, that there are atoms swirling about in infinite space, and they are infinite because nothing can come from nothing. We have atoms, so the atoms must be eternal. And so the coming together of the atoms and the juxtaposition of the bouncing of one against the other requires some kind of an explanation. Now, unlike Lucretius, he doesn't leave it to mechanical bouncing around of the atoms. He gives the word God for that. So God comes into his vocabulary, but God is just a word for the vitality of matter. Matter has a reason, a principle within it, and the word God is used to say that. So God fits very poorly in Tolan, but it is officially a materialistic monist kind of pantheism. Fast forward to the 19th century, someone who's very interesting, I think, is Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson's dispute is that of Christianity. He was a minister and dissatisfied with the Unitarian tradition in general and with the traditional notion of revelation. And revelation connotes it was associated with the transcendence of God, and so in rejecting revelation as traditionally defined, he rejects the transcendence of God. Replaces God with the cosmic psyche, because eventually the oversoul. This is a panpsychism. And the oversoul is all that is. The natural world is the self-embodying of the oversoul, and it is that we are part and parcel of the oversoul. This is a very often quoted. He's speaking here about, it's almost like a mystical experience that he's describing here. He's standing, as he explains in the context, he's standing on Boston Common at the end of a winter day, a winter afternoon, and he feels exhilarated to the brink of fear, he says. Standing on the bare ground, I am baked by the bright air, and uplifted into infinite space, all meaning egotism and vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball, which is his word for enlightenment. I am nothing, I see all. It seems very much like a mystical experience of man and nature. The occurrence of the universal being, that's his oversoul, circulates through me. I am part, is the great mind, or parcel of God. Now, after 1836, the word God, he continues to use the traditional word, vocabulary, but God now means cosmic psyche. Whereas in his early days, God meant God, now that he is cosmic psyche. So we have then an American version, and he says revelation, interesting definition, is the disclosure of the soul. Because the oversoul is not in us, we are in the oversoul. There's only one soul, and we are part and parcel of it. So we have a right, so to speak, to say something. Revelation is the disclosure of the soul. So that's truly a baptism as well. Okay? Amen? All right. I do have a summary, but I didn't get to it. So, all right. But God is interesting. Roberta? This is nature. Nature. Now, there are two essays called Nature. This is in the 1841 edition. Nature Addresses and Lectures. In writing, this because of the life This makes sense, yes. I think today, I would suggest if you're all interested in this, if you go on to Pantheism.net, that's the website. of the world pantheism movement today. It's quite attractive, and it's quite revealing. I think it's safe to say that they have a certain amount of hostility to Christianity, but what dominates, I think, is the environmentalism. I think it has gotten a second wind from the environmental movement right now. So pantheism does that. I think that you're always just doing that, but it's like this. Anything else we can say, answer or speak to? Okay. All right. Great.
Oh, I've got I will pull hers off so I can put mine on. Now, that fits, the action I just did fits into part of what I'm presenting today. So let me, what I'm using here is is some software called Prezi. For those of you who are interested in learning something about how the software works, I recommend it. Go to Prezi.com, it's completely free, and you're about to see what it can do. It's image-based, and so you can see that the image that I'm choosing to use is that of a mosquito. So, you'll understand why that's important in a moment. For our viewing audience, my name is Dr. Sebastian Mafu. I'm an associate professor of interdisciplinary studies at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut. My presentation is called Mosquito Mating Habits, the New Atheism, an investigation of how Dawkins' memes are shaping the conversation. So, after all that build-up of what Prezi can do. I leave this on there for my biographers. There's no doubt as to who's responsible for this, for the good and for the bad. Now, I wrote a book in which I discussed the New Atheism, and I co-authored it with Rhonda Chervin. And the presentation I'm going to give you now, it builds off of this book. So I'm going to try to keep this under 15 minutes. If I leave out anything, just buy my book. The subtitle is A Framework for the Refutation of Atheism and the Evangelization of Atheists. Atheists are not our enemy. They're human persons created in the image and likeness of God. But they've got something that they are pursuing, something that's being inculcated within them, that is making their belief system and their doing system, the way in which they act in the world, at variance with theism, with those of us who subscribe to the idea of God. And you'll see in a moment how our God is smarter than your average God. Go back to the mosquito. So let me get the mating habits motif out of the way. And I'll tell you a story. Mosquitoes, when they mate, it's a very interesting phenomenon. I'm delivering this for Dawkins' benefit, since as an evolutionary biologist, he already has this concept in his head. Imagine a swarm of male mosquitoes. Now, anybody who's spent any time on any of the islands in the Eastern Caribbean will not have too much trouble imagining a swarm of mosquitoes. And imagine into that swarm flies a lot of female mosquitoes. And during that swarming process, that sort of hot tub, if you will, of the mosquito mating world, magic happens. And we end up a little bit later with more mosquitoes. Now, the magic is simply this. A male mosquito will attach himself to a female mosquito and inject his sperm into her body. He's done. He goes on about his way. But that female mosquito is still in that swarm of male mosquitoes. She has the opportunity for another hookup. The next male mosquito shows up to that female mosquito. It inserts a device, if you will, that rips out the previous male's sperm. And then he injects his own sperm. And this happens throughout the evening. Or, you know, whatever. So the last male mosquito to get to the female is the one that's able to perpetuate his genes. And the babies, the young larvae, the eggs that are fertilized from that encounter, transmit the fittest, the strongest, whatever. Okay, so moving to the next slide. Dawkins, to do a brief segue, comes up with this idea of the selfish gene. He published this in the mid-70s, 1976, of that. Now, the basic idea of the selfish gene, he explains, is to examine the biology of selfishness and altruism. If you think about it, in a Darwinian evolutionary world, why would we be altruistic? Why would we do something contrary to our own interest to advance the interest of somebody else? So if you look at individuals, you see it happening all the time. Altruism is a threat, unless you take it down to the genetic level. Now, at the genetic level, you've got gene pools, and the goal of the gene pool is to perpetuate itself. The purpose of the body is to get new genes, so that genes can survive down the generations and simply throw away the bodies. It's the gene that survives. And so if you've got people who are genetically similar to one another, it makes sense that the genes would act selfishly in their own preservation, even if the individual acts altruistically in the preservation of somebody else at his own expense. So, biologically, a gene does that. Culturally, a meme does something very similar. Now, he defines a meme, he came up with this term, he's proud of it, as a kind of replicator that conveys the idea of a cultural transmission or a unit of imitation. And he puts in italics the word imitation. Or in short, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, an idea, behavior, or style that spreads from person to person within a culture. So we're filled with memes. These are ideas that are passed down to us. These are ideas that we perpetuate and we advance. So the idea itself, the meme itself, acts genetically. It wants to advance itself and continue to live. So, big deal, right? Except for Dawkins, it explains something. Because almost immediately after asserting the concept of a meme, he gives a for example. And the for example is simply this. Dawkins asserts, almost immediately after establishing the idea, that the idea of God is also a meme. He surmises that the God meme has survived because it provides a superficially plausible answer to deep and troubling questions about existence. So that God exists if only in the form of a meme with high survival value or effective power in the environment provided by human culture. Okay. So, the God lineage is to carry over. It's found a way to replicate and perpetuate itself over the generations, even though empirical science, so-called, according to Dawkins at least, can demonstrate that God doesn't exist, and that if God did exist, he would have to come at the end product of a long period of evolution and be irreducibly complex, rather than coming at the beginning and being the foundation or the sustaining power that holds everything. So he's true to his, he's internally coherent up to this point. If religion had stayed around, even in the face of absolute proof to the contrary, then it had to have stayed around because it's some kind of meme that's perpetuating itself through the ages. Okay, so the meme then deals with the transmission of ideas, and transmission can happen in one of these 4 ways. So in my abstract, I left out revelation, but I put it in after some period of thought, because it is, though by custom in some way, it is an important qualification on its own. Let me go through the 4 ways. How shall I love thee? I can count the ways. By custom. This happens when the idea is inherited, such as one's beliefs or lack thereof, which are passed down over time. So that's custom. We have traditions. For instance, my wife once told me of a story that she read about a woman who always cut her ham in exactly 2/3 before cooking it. Why did she do that? Well, she had a pot that was big enough to cook the whole ham. But she did it because she grew up with her mother always cutting the ham into 2/3 before cooking it, because her mother had a much smaller pot. So she just picked up on that and perpetuated it, even though there was no reason to continue doing it. Okay. By reason. This happens when an idea is developed through a process of discovery, such as the work done by the scholastics to synthesize faith and reason, or the work done by Einstein that overturned Newtonian physics. So by reason, we actually apply our minds to something and figure out a new method, and that becomes the thing that is perpetuated. So up until Einstein, everybody did Newtonian physics, because that's how they were trained. That was the paradigm. And after Einstein, you can switch. They evolve, if you will. Thank you. Third, by revelation. This happens when God speaks directly to us through scripture and tradition, letting us know what we cannot know through reason alone. And a friend of mine, Kevin Simmons, just published a whole book on Reflections of Light, where he talks about private revelation, where those of us, and this is controversial now because of Mitch Gordon, those of us who are not living in ancient times and are receiving messages extra scriptural, extra traditional. That's revelation. And then the fourth is by force. This happens when an idea established by custom or reason is discounted without the use of either of those methods to advance a particular ideology that has an agenda of its own. And we could say by custom or reason or revelation. This new meaning that enters the culture is unnatural to it, acting in a way like a virus attacking an otherwise healthy organism. So you see this in paradigmatic revolutions. So if you read Thomas Kuhn's Structural Scientific Revolution, that something happens that upsets the apple cart. Now, and sometimes that's by reason. So for instance, Einsteinian revolution. Sometimes it's by force. You actually have somebody come with a sword and say, you will do it a different way. You will believe a different way. And we know that faith is not a matter of coercion. Reason is definitely not a matter of coercion. Because to be forced into believing something is unreasonable. One could write a whole book on that. So here we go. We have our mosquito motif coming back. What's a mosquito do? What's the nature of a mosquito? If you were to take the genus, I mean the substance, the nature of mosquito, what would we say those things are? Bloodsuckers. Okay. They require a host in order to survive. They feed off of something else that's living. They're parasites. Is there a parasite family? They're parasitic. If there's a distinction between parasite and parasitic, I'll let the biologist answer that. So here we are. We can come back to the fullness of the mosquito motif. And this is not an ad hominem argument, by the way, but it makes sense to represent the male mosquito in this image as Dawkins. Because what's he trying to do? He's going to the church, to the theists, to the faith, and he's trying to rip out what he calls the cultural memes that would have been implanted there over the generations, and then stuff in his own. So that what is given birth to is an atheism, not just individually, but at the level of a gene. Genes and memes are similar in their characteristics. If he can do this culturally, then he transforms the entire society. So then it becomes a question that we would have as theists of how do we engage the atheists who have had their whatever theistic means they might have had in them from the cultures in which they grew up, that had those ripped out and replaced with something else. Now, we who engage in missionary activity, in evangelization, also engage in a process of inspiring others to become theists. And so there may be cultural means that we would rip out. But I would say we don't rip them out. I would say we inspire people with a belief in God. But when you have a militant, apologetic individual who was going around giving talks and writing books at the level of the college freshman, if you've read God Religion, he's targeting that audience. I used to teach freshman composition and freshman rhetoric. Any freshman in college, God bless them, they're beautiful people, for those of you listening on it, is going to have similar fallacies and jump over syllogistic processes to make it to a point. And that's exactly what he does. He runs through all of Thomas's 5 ways in a few pages. He gets through 4 of them in like 2 pages. There's a little more time on the argument in the side.
Mutation in the mind. 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 Mutation in the
Dawkins made this himself. Here, in the interest of time, I'm going to cut that short. It goes another minute, but I'll get to my conclusion. So there you have it. So you can find that on YouTube. So the conclusion is simply, how can we inoculate ourselves against the spread of this potential malaria that we would call atheistic cultural memes? And I will zip through them in a minute and a half, 90 seconds, 1 minute. Thank you. We have a very strict timekeeper. If you waste your time, it's okay. It was just given to us by Christ. I'll just leave it at that. 10:27. Love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, that's stuff that we could have gotten out of natural law. Christ tells it to us explicitly. So, if that's the formula, then there's a few things we can do. And there's 3 things that we can do that are very practical. We can establish in our minds an image of God, aligned with what we know through custom, reason, and revelation, and allow that image the freedom to grow. That's the pursuit of our faith, enables that understanding to grow. Faith seeking understanding. Dawkins has an image in his mind of God. This is his image. This is from the God Delusion, where he says God is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, and then delivers a series of epithets. Father Barron recently gave a talk where he said, just figure out the image of God that the person has. What is your image of God? What is our image of God? As we notice that there are many variant kinds of pantheists, there are many variant kinds of theists, and we engage actively in discussion with them as well. The second thing, establish in our minds a proper understanding of ourselves, whom Christ, as Donnie Mitzvah tells us, fully reveals to ourselves. That's one. Establish in our minds a proper understanding of man, created in God's image and likeness, with the desire to pursue our eternal destiny in joyful communion with Him, and cultivate the realization that that applies to everyone, even the atheist. So we are all in community in Christ. And that is the end of my presentation.
Wow, I am in trouble here. First, I am keeping you from lunch, never a good thing. Second, I have a very strict timekeeper in Richmond Bar. I mean, it's brutal. And I didn't bring any mosquito pornography. Full video of drawing you, but I didn't draw your presentation very much. So I'll do as best as I can under the circumstances. Oh, okay, all right. Well, let me make a few quick comments about where my paper is somewhat situated in this conference. You know, we've heard a lot of other papers, I think, that have a relation to mine. Professor DeBlasio spoke about the need for God and natural law. We talked about Adler's God and philosophers, and in that piece, Adler mentions that Calvinism is not allowed for natural rights. And Professor Hancock pointed out that Stephen Jay Gould says that religious moral values are not factual. That was his view. I'm sure many of us disagree. So, my paper, The Failure of New Atheist Morality, is meant to show that all is not well in the world of the new atheists. I don't think they have an adequate foundation for objective moral values. And so in that sense, I think they're in trouble. Okay, so John Claude, Catholic theologian, has a book called God and New Atheism. And he says that these are scientists and philosophers described to a belief system that Huck called scientific naturalism. And Huck says the central dogma of scientific naturalism is the following, quote, only nature, including humans and our creation, is real. God does not exist, and that science can give us complete and reliable knowledge of reality, end quote. Now, Huck's description makes clear that scientific naturalists are committed to two beliefs. First is scientism, which is the view that only science can give us complete and reliable knowledge of reality, of course, even science in the modern sense, physics, chemistry. And the second is metaphysical naturalism, which is the view that no supernatural entities exist, just matter and energy or something like that. Now, in holding both of these beliefs, scientific naturalists separate themselves from the majority of scientists and philosophers who reject at least one of these beliefs, usually in practice. Nevertheless, scientific naturalism is a growing movement. Because of their commitment to scientism and metaphysical naturalism, scientific naturalists have claimed the methods of science can successfully study topics traditionally considered outside of the bounds of science, such as ethics. For example, Dawkins in the God Delusion puts forth an argument that, quote, our sense of right and wrong can be derived from our Darwinian past, end quote. And Sam Harris, in his book, The Moral Landscape, How Science Can Determine Human Value, argues that, quote, morality can and should be integrated with our scientific understanding of the natural world. Now, last year, some of you here, not YouTube, but some of you here might remember I discussed the problems of scientific. So today I'm going to focus on metaphysical naturalism, and that the new atheists and other naturalists accept, with the goal of answering the following questions. So this, for me, is the big question. Can metaphysical naturalism provide an adequate foundation for objective moral value? I shall argue that the answer is no, and I will discuss several serious problems in a naturalistic account of the foundation of morality. Before I can do this, however, I want to clarify what I mean by objective moral value. I'm not crazy about the word value. I'm going to define, hopefully, be clear what I'm talking about. First, I hold that moral values are prescriptive. That is, they tell us how we should act. The word should, however, can be used in different ways. For example, if you want to climb Mount Everest, you should buy a very warm coat. You should pack enough food and supplies. And you should get a good Sherpa to guide you. Maybe you should call Peter DeMarco and he knows some people who can help you. I don't know. But of course, instead of doing all of that, you could say, you know, I've decided not to climb the mountain. After all, mountain climbing is optional. Morality, however, is not optional, or at least it shouldn't be if it's going to have any strength of morality. This raises a second point, namely that moral prescriptions carry with them a force of inescapable necessity. Immanuel Kant is insisting that the supreme moral principle was not hypothetical but categorical, and thus binding on all rational beings at all times recognize this type of necessity. Third and finally, I hold that a moral proposition such as parental child abuse is wrong is either true or false. In this particular case, of course, I argue that the proposition is true. No parent should abuse the child. As such, I will not entertain the view that moral values are neither true nor false, as non-cognitivist philosophers hold, or I will not entertain that they are merely subjectively true or culturally true, as moral relativists hold. Okay. So, you know, in the history of Western philosophy, Plato tries to ground ethics on the form of good, the evil thinkers ground it on God, but the new atheists cannot appeal to those types of entities. So that's up to them. Can the scientific naturalists provide a metaphysical foundation that explains how moral values are objectively true, prescriptive, and carry with them an inescapable necessity? That's the challenge. Okay, now, my first argument would be that objective moral values cannot exist if no moral agents. There are no moral agents at all. Now, a necessary condition for moral agency is metaphysical freedom, which is the ability of an agent to have acted other than she did, because she has control over her actions. Even Immanuel Kant, who was certainly skeptical of traditional metaphysics, affirmed that freedom of the will, well, I would prefer free choice, but freedom of the will is a necessary postulate of pure practical reason, without which morality is impossible. Obviously, scientific naturalists cannot appeal to any supernatural moral agents, they don't do that. Therefore, if it turns out that metaphysical naturalism is not compatible with the freedom of living physical beings, then metaphysical naturalism cannot serve as a satisfactory foundation for objective moral value. So, let's examine it. There have certainly been some scientists and philosophers who have understood metaphysical naturalism to preclude human freedom. Consider, for example, the comments, and he's a new atheist, of neuroscientist and new atheist Sam Harris. In a chapter section titled The Illusion of Free Will, in his book, The Moral Landscape, he writes the following, quote, "You tend to feel that you are the source of your own thoughts and actions. You decide what to do and not to do. You seem to be an agent acting of your own free will. As we will see, however, this point of view cannot be reconciled with what we know about the human brain. All of our behavior can be traced back to biological events about which we have no conscious knowledge. You are no more responsible for the next thing you think, and therefore do, than you are for the fact that you were born into this world." Obviously, when metaphysical naturalism is understood in this narrow, reductive, and determinist way, it cannot serve as an adequate foundation for freedom or for objective moral values. For this reason, many naturalists have embraced a broader understanding of metaphysical naturalism, one they claim is compatible with human freedom. Indeed, even some Christian philosophers and theologians have embraced a view very similar to this, namely that everything which exists except for God is a physical being. For example, Nancy Murphy, in her book Bodies and Souls, or Spirited Bodies, says the following, quote, "Jesus is, first, that we are our bodies. There is no additional metaphysical element such as mind, soul, or spirit. But second, this physicalist position need not deny that we are intelligent, moral, and spiritual." So she's doesn't want to get rid of morality with intelligence or apparently. Murphy calls her position non-reductive physicalism, and apart from her stance on God, which of course many atheists would not, non-reductive physicalism seems like the only option left for metaphysical naturalists if they want to defend human freedom and objective moral values. Now, I've argued elsewhere that there are serious problems with non-reductive physicalism. I'm not going to go over all that here, but let me just make a quick comment. In order for non-reductive physicalism to be different from the narrow understanding of physicalism discussed above, non-reductive physicalists must hold that new qualitative powers, such as freedom, can emerge in living organisms over time. Because scientific naturalists do not want to appeal to souls or non-material entities, they must hold that these new qualitative powers emerge ultimately from complex arrangements of microphysical parts. However, here's where we get into the problem. With the exception of quantum indeterminacy, the microphysical world is determinative. In addition, quantum indeterminacy, which is a kind of statistical randomness, is not enough for genuine freedom. Even if quantum events are random, I will not be free if my actions are caused by quantum events over which I have no control. As such, it does not seem possible that the causal power to make genuinely free choices can emerge in the microphysical world. Okay, so I could almost stop at this point. I'm not yet, Richard, because if the new atheists can't get over the problem of freedom, well, then morality is lost. But for sake of argument, let's assume for sake of argument that somehow through evolution, beings that can make genuinely free choices can emerge. Well, then I still think there are problems, okay? A common strategy employed by the scientific naturalists has been to argue that morality is a product of and was founded upon biological evolution. For example, as I mentioned above, Dawkins made a Darwinian argument for the existence of moral values in evolution. There he discusses how evolution can select for various things, including altruism towards kin and reciprocal altruism. But is this an adequate metaphysical foundation for objective moral values? Can the fact that evolution has selected for altruism towards kin, for example, make the proposition parents should not abuse their children objectively true? It seems to me that the answer is no for several reasons. First, as Richard Joyce has argued, even if morality is the product of evolution and thus is useful to the survival of the species, it still could be a fiction. This serves to undermine in the sense of casting doubt upon the truth of our moral beliefs. He says, quote, "Our moral beliefs are products of a process that is entirely independent of their truth, which forces the recognition that we have no grounds one way or the other for maintaining these beliefs. They could be true, but we have no reason for thinking so." End quote. More serious is the second problem. Insofar as objective moral values have to be prescriptive, how can we move from the historical fact that evolution selected for X to the moral fact that parents should do X? This is directly related to David Hume's point that we cannot derive an ought how things should be from an is the way things are. It is not enough to respond that parents should treat their children well because it is a fact that this will be good for the future of the human species. That is the type of should we discussed earlier when I said a person planning to climb Mount Everest should buy a warm coat. Such shoulds are merely conditional on whether we decide to pursue the end in question, and they do not carry the inescapable necessity of the moral prescription. Instead, to argue against Hume, we need a way to overcome the is-ought problem. Unlike the new atheists, I think theists have an advantage here. For example, Alasdair MacIntyre argued in After Virtue that the is-ought problem can only be overcome by recognizing that human nature has an essential purpose and function, which of course has its ultimate foundation in God. In other words, teleology is the key to overcoming the result problem. But the new atheists, aside from rejecting God, also seem unanimous in their rejection of teleology in nature. They seem either to want intrinsic finality, which one talks about, or extrinsic finality, like Paley. And I'm not so sure if they all understand this distinction, but Curtis mentioned this with blind watchmakers, so I'm going to not give that interpretation. Now, some naturalist philosophers have argued for a kind of teleology in nature that requires a supernatural foundation. But even if this were possible, and I don't think it is, the problem is that such teleology would be, at best, a contingent root fact with no reason for its being. And this leads to two additional arguments why I think that a person would be justified in holding that evolution, as understood by the scientific naturalists, is neither an adequate foundation for the truth of moral prescriptions, nor for their inescapable necessity. How many minutes do I have? 2? Oh wow, I'm going to skip the contingency argument and go right. 3? Okay. Okay. So another argument that I'm going to is 1 minute merciful. I have an argument called the transcendence of persons argument. It goes like this. Okay, there are several senses in which I as a person transcend the mechanisms of evolution and thus am not subject. For example, evolution might explain why I have the inclination to desire children, but does this put upon me a moral obligation to have children? No. I also transcend the mechanisms of evolution in the sense that I have the power to alter the course of evolution through genetic engineering. I want to engineer faces and things. Finally, as a rational being, I am a rational and free being. To the non-rational and non-free mechanisms of evolution, thus I transcend them. As such, any moral inclination or rule of thumb produced by evolution lacks the necessary force required for moral prescription. There is something of an irony here for scientific naturalists who embrace non-reductive physicalism. The very non-reductive physicalism they hope makes the emergence of reason and freedom possible for humans, but also make humans transcend in the ways described above the physical world and its processes. For the scientific naturalists, there's a sense in which a human being is like God. This is because in the world of scientific naturalists, human beings, at least as far as we know, are the supreme form of life. Humans alone, it appears, exist with freedom and reason in the physical universe, largely filled with lifeless matter and mostly or exclusively non-intelligent and lesser life forms. With no God and humans occupying the role of supreme beings, why should humans look to evolution or anything else in nature as the foundation for objective moral value? This opens the door to the dark path of Friedrich Nietzsche that Etienne Bresson warned about in his essay, The Terrors of the Year 2000. It is the path of asserting your own will and creating your own moral values without being limited by nature or the values of the masses. It is a dangerous path and one that is compatible with objective moral value. Right? Okay. Although the arguments above that I've given above are not, they cast serious doubt on the view that the metaphysical naturalism can provide a satisfactory metaphysical foundation for objective moral values. Indeed, the new atheist attempt to ground objective morality in metaphysical naturalism fails for 3 reasons. First, metaphysical naturalism cannot account for freedom of moral agency. Second, the is-ought problem in the context of metaphysical naturalism precludes the prescriptive nature of objective moral value. Third, and finally, the problems of contingency and transcendence of persons, which result from metaphysical naturalism, preclude the necessary force that are supposed to accompany objective moral values. So if this analysis is correct, there's only 2 options. Either we give up objective moral values, and there's lots of problems with that, or I think we need to argue that objective moral values have a non-natural foundation. Of course, I'll have to argue that another time. Thank you.
Excellent. Now, since we have some time, we can open up the floor to questions to any of our 3 presenters, and also include Ms. Erb, who did an excellent paper on modernism, and so we'll include that in the question period as well. Any questions?
I have one which has been directed to all of you. Can science be the most perfect form of right reason? St. Thomas and Aristotle say that science, in the sense of philosophy, is practical, is deductive, or speculative, or speaking of right reason. So can science be the most perfect form of right reason and simultaneously be practical? That is, can you maintain, which I think is the modern reduction, not simply of positivism, but that while the most perfect kind of knowledge that a human being is capable of possessing, that this is practical or productive knowledge.
Do you mean modern mathematical science, or do you mean the old?
No, I mean, I'm saying that modern science, even if it's not positivistic, claiming that the whole of truth, lies in mathematical physics. Modern science is that it deserves a title of science. No, perfection, and this is productive knowledge. So I would deny, personally, I would deny.
So we can't be complete knowledge, right? The limitations of what science can handle. We can't handle the ethical questions in life. So if they want the title, we can complete that work, right?
And so they'd have to say it's an inferior kind of knowledge.
Well, they wouldn't want to admit that.
It seems to be against simultaneously say that you're possessed with the highest motive, you understand science in the highest, perfection of the human intellect, and this is an act of production, or it's a practical act, what I call performance activity.
One of the problems with science, with science in items or studies that are not physical in nature, social sciences, the weird sciences become a view purely. And there is actually a phenomenon of science as human in classical it's a changing paradigm. So if you change the paradigm so often, you fight it out, figure out that it's kind of a body of knowledge.
No, and that's exactly what you're talking about. It's an explanatory, and you're trying to get a speculative understanding. That you ultimately have to come back to the notion that science, strictly speaking, is speculative. You would agree?
Yes, and within social sciences, there is the school, the schools of psychology, schools of sociology, and so on, schools of economics, schools of political theory. So that disarray allows disallows.
So at least the way you're considering it, that if you consider science to be predicated analogous, that prime analogous is speculative, no, and it can't be practical.
Right, and this is probably based on the
Yeah, but it seems to me that the modern proponents of claiming that they're engaged in mathematical physics, and this is science, is precisely the fact that this is the best of human knowledge, and yet they don't subordinate this to any higher kind of knowledge, which seems to me that they've taken science out of the genus of science. They claim it to be the whole of it, not a species of it, and lowering in the hierarchy, which is one of the criticisms that have but he just attributed it to the positivistic side. I say, no, I'll go beyond that. And my argument is that it's based on Aristotle, that productive science, and here I'm making an analogy with a baseball player who doesn't know what the other players do, or doesn't know what sport. I play baseball, but what sports? Or what's the perfection of the exercise, physical activity. I don't know that, but I'm a baseball player. I say, well, you can't possibly confess that in a scientific way, because you don't, strictly speaking, that you know what you are. You don't understand the nature of the genes, you don't understand the nature of the species. Because the genus exists within the species. The species are more or less perfections of the generic act. When I look at it, Aristotle says that productive knowledge, the making of products, is essentially connected to human activity, performance activity. Like to manufacture production, of clothes or a house or something. But, well, you desire that for what reason? You only desire that as a tool. So the highest form of human learning can't be possibly to make tools. For what reason? Well, I like making tools. But strictly speaking, okay, say you like making tools. Strictly speaking, can you make a tool? Can you manufacture a tool? Well, that's an act of choice, no? Now, strictly speaking, what do you choose? Let's use my 2-year-old now. What do you choose? What do you choose? Do you ever choose a thing? What do you choose? You choose a relationship. I choose to hold a pen. It's instrumental activity in this. It's an instrument for me. Right? It's part of a human relationship. And so if you try to reduce science to production, you're reducing it to the relationship of a human being to a tool. Right? But that's only for the performance activity. What? Well, I want the pen so I can write. The human activity. And I want the fork and the knife so I can eat food. I'm holding the fork. I'm choosing to do what? I'm not choosing to knife. I'm choosing to hold the knife with the cup. And more moral choice, the moral choice. Now you get beyond just productive activity, you get to practical activity, dancing. What you choose to move your body in a specific way. Now, is that the perfect? So the productive knowledge can't exist, strictly speaking, without being hierarchically related to the performance activity. And if there's an order of performance activity, you can't claim that the highest activity in the performance activity is productive or practical. It's got to ultimately be speculative. So divorcing knowledge from the perfection of speculative activity, which would be wisdom, means you can't possess science.
But to engage the modern empirical scientists, they're going to have to present not so much negative as positive. And you're going to get them. You're going to engage more than the 20% that you can provide an understanding of what they're doing. Absolutely. And set it on much more.
Yeah, well, I think the modern physicists, okay, would be fundamentally in agreement, for example, with what I'm saying, and they're not going to look at this negative because they're being handcuffed by this narrow understanding of what they do. That they don't. And even people in business, doesn't talk about what they actually do.
Would you say that because the modern mathematical physics is correct, you not explain to the person, that's because it's going to do God, but he was going to abstraction, but he was going to truth, and what's going to do. For that reason,
Yeah, they've divorced science from an activity of the human person, from the scientist, yet they pride themselves precisely in being scientific because they're able to cause the reasoning processes by means of which they can draw the conclusions that are so great. Modern physical science is a wondrous thing, but what I'm claiming that the method of explanation that these people are giving here, it's like somebody who makes great food. And you run into these people or engage in any kind of practice, they do that. What are you doing? And they know how to make it. They're great at doing it. But to the extent that they're great at doing it, and also able to give the explanation of what they do. So both sides of the explanation.
Yeah, and they're humble. It's the true intelligent scientists. They're humble. They understand the limitations of their methodology.
Right. These people are legitimate scientists because they're putting this within a hierarchy of relationship to this productive knowledge exists for the purpose of servicing human faculties. So underlying this, even though they're saying, well, I'm just making tools, you have a reference to human faculties.
Well, I think the denying of the right to use the word science is a whole story.
I'm not denying that. I'm denying it to the people who take this out of that kind of hierarchy. I'm saying strictly speaking, that's an equivocation. Those people who would admit that, you know, that there is some sort of an hierarchy, you predicate the term science hierarchically, analogously, right? And so you can't maintain that if you can't explain what you're doing, that you're the best. You know, at this activity, because the person who not only can do what you're doing, but also can give the explanation of the causes and how this is all connected. The person who's able to go and apprehend how the parts are connected to each other and relate to each other and to the whole. And the media activity will do that.
Get the rocket to the moon and the precise point and the precise location without going to that.
That's true. So they're not as good as the person. They're not as perfect as the person who can do it and explain.
Yes, that's the question. Your presentation staff was really extensive, however. I was involved in advertising for a number of years. I know my students, I know the work. Advertising space. But I think it's part of today. That it's easy to sell society and just society. Explain Pantheism, explain the last thing of orthodoxy, explain Gnosticism, and speaking fast, rapidly, and no way to say I am spiritual. That is ingrained in every child, into every science, into every student under own knowledge, spiritual, even local that.
Sure. Well, it's new age. You've got Gnosticism runs amok.
It started, not just recently. It started to reach God of death. And now we're just going to go on spiritual religion. I don't think we know. Our philosophy of theology is important, but I'll ask you how we come back. It's sort of in music, it's in our clothes, it's in every routine. So you want to accelerate, I am spiritual, and not spiritual. As you say, Father, I will go with you towards it.
Look up
They're not related to it.
from the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, a document called Water is Life. That will have some ideas.
Questions, what is your view on this house if you shift again? And you can further that how you didn't use the word because
Oh, yeah, I definitely would use the good, and I do as the meaning place for evangelization. All persons pursue the good. There are several times, but they pursue the good as they proceed. So the question is there a common ground where we can all set ourselves on the good that all of us perceive and grow from there? But I had a timekeeper that kept jabbing me. Sorry, I don't mean to blame my timekeeper. You did excellent. Thank you. But no, Peter, definitely.
Well, he works in
The good is the common. Thank you.
Is the word mean to play on mimic?
Yeah, an imitation. So me. Yeah.
Doesn't sound the way that you.
Right. Well, he was going for that parallel, and you saw that parallel in his video that he put out, Memes and Genes. And yeah, well, the last minute you didn't miss much. He comes out and he plays an electric flute for the audience, but he's obviously sensationalizing what he's doing in order to make it attractive to a particular audience who seemed to. We didn't see the audience of that shot, but it seemed that they would have been college age or younger.
Sophomores, correct.
I mean, there has to be leaders. All of a sudden, within 2 years, the problem is what every day. Morning mass, the church
probably within 2 years, this change policy disappeared from the parliament. There has to be some type of mean helpful environment.
The meme idea is a good idea, but when you use it as a political tool in order to advance an agenda, then you've or an advertising, anything like that, right? You can use it for a different purpose than the good. Toxic memes.
I guess, Lois in particular, this is, Pantheism, that's reflected in some of those, most of those activities, some of the science fiction, Star Wars series. You know, is that, see that connection? Is that
Yes,
reflect this?
yes, I was thinking myself, the biggest one for the country is that I did hit upon the cosmos theory, if you remember, see the class, if you remember that back in the 1980s, Carl Sagan had a very famous, very well-received thing on cosmos, and this was a reboot of it. It was March of last year, 2014, and it was Neil, what's his name, deGrasse Tyson, presented Bruno as a model to science. Now, with regard to the integrity of science, that was absolutely vulnerable to say that that Bruno was a model to science. He was not a scientist, more important as a scientist. And so the whole business of this contemporary movie making version of it is under a cloud right now. I can't see how they can begin to justify themselves as scientists if they do that kind of shabby research. So it is popular. It is a meme, I suppose you could say, Star Wars and environmentalism. And,
My reflection would be to get her state was political reason.
yeah, I found a number of the articles about it. Dug in his heels, and they didn't expect, one is that they didn't expect him to dig in his heels because he had come back to Venice unwisely and proved that he should have stayed out of Venice. But they apprehended him, put him in prison, and kept him there for several months, which was very unusual. And I couldn't find any reason why they would keep him in prison for so long. And they expected him to say, well, maybe I made a mistake, and then they let him go. But he just dug in his heels, and so they had no. So in that sense, it could have been political as well. I don't know the political what he was doing because he seems to be, in one sense, very apolitical. He wandered about so much.
I think Raymond Moore, Carl Sagan used to demonize the Catholic Church.
He never really acknowledged because of the creationist and I think that the modern, I haven't seen the latest incarnation of that.
Oh, yes, certainly, yes. He's a lot to do that.
That's a great segue. And now I think we should break and go.
One more question.
Yes, well, I can say one quick comment. The basic opinion on Sullivan is that I think one of the acceptance implicit or implicit not all reflect that and intended. But for example, consequences of the event are in place. And we have Latin document. So once in the creative history I recommended alongside others. And then in the presence movement, I was there as a gun. So, you know, you look at the history of a change that we have. I do think
All right. Thank you, everybody.
that.
We're going to regroup here at exactly 1:30 Eastern Daylight Time. God bless. See you.